It's the story of the American Civil War. I find that a very interesting story, and I wanted to present it in a way that would be interesting both to students and to the reading public. Now, I published it with a textbook publisher, so it's going mostly right now to read it to students, but I hope it's one that would be interesting to the public too. I wanted to tell it as a story. I think that people naturally like stories. I think that's the way we are. We are hardwired to enjoy stories. So that's how I wanted to present it. As I was thinking about writing the book, one thing that I noticed was that there are some very long textbooks about the Civil War, books that are signed. I'm thinking of, some of them are very good. James McPherson's Pulitzer Prize winning Battle Cry of Freedom, but it's more than 800 pages long, which is fine if you want an 800-page book. But, what if you want something a little shorter? Many professors like to assign a smaller book alongside of a general history of the war, and there wouldn't be much room to do that with an 800-page book. And frankly, I think a lot of students would not be keen about reading 800 pages anyway for a course. Then there were some books that were extremely short. I'm thinking here also of some good ones, but maybe 190 or 200 pages. And that's fine, but it gets a little antiseptic. And I had actually used some of those in my classes, had assigned them, and the students said they were so condensed and so bare bones that it was almost a little hard to follow and hard to be drawn into it. So I wanted a book that would be long enough that you could really tell a story and yet not 800 pages long. So I shot for about 300, 350 pages. As to why I chose to write it as a story, I felt that that would naturally be interesting to people and it would naturally be understandable. They might say, well, that's obvious. Doesn't everybody write their books that way? Well, some authors do. But a lot of times, especially if a book is written to be used in class, written to be assigned in a course, to some degree the author feels obligated to cover a number of different things. We've got to cover this, got to cover that. And so we have sections on one thing and another, and we don't really march through the story in a way that I think is interesting, compelling, and understandable. So you get a book that covers a little bit of everything, all the little odd topics that have to be covered, but yet doesn't have a good narrative thread that it follows. And so I wanted that good narrative thread. In telling the story of the Civil War as a story, you have characters who are important. You look at those most important characters and you follow them. The decisions that they make have consequences, which leads to other things. I think some of the things that go into a story are the assumption that individuals are significant. Sure, masses of people are significant, millions of people are significant, but individuals are significant. Abraham Lincoln made decisions, Jefferson Davis made decisions, Grant made decisions, Lee made decisions, and those decisions made a difference. And I might add also many other people at lower levels made decisions that had significant consequences that changed the course of history. And so people make significant decisions, and another thing I think that goes into telling a story is that history is not inevitable. It's not, in fact, I just don't like the word inevitable for history. Nothing is inevitable if people make different decisions. The decisions they make are important, but nothing about that had to happen if people would have made different decisions. So you follow the decisions they make, and I think that gives a natural drama to it. I mean, not to over-dramatize, but it does make a certain drama to it that they faced decisions, they faced problems, and they had to make decisions, and they had to cope with those problems and overcome, and then that determined the flow, the course that events took. I think it's important for people to find the Civil War accessible and interesting and enjoyable, because I think the Civil War is an important topic. And if you enjoy something and it's accessible and interesting, you're going to come to understand it and you're going to remember it and learn from it. And that's important with the Civil War. I've been reading recently people writing about maybe we're headed for a second Civil War, a second episode of secession. That's a little hard to believe, but who knows what the future might hold. We certainly live in interesting times, and when we understand the past, it's not exactly that history repeats itself. The same exact things don't happen. I don't look for Ulysses Grant or Robert E. Lee to show up again doing the same things. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And similar things lead to similar results. Now, the fact that we're sitting in front of a Civil War statue And it kind of raises the whole issue of the Civil War statue controversy that we have today. And you know, a lot of people are very much against having Confederate statues or statues that monumentalize the Confederacy, having that in public places. And there's a reason for that, and that is, and whether we like to admit it or not, whether we wish it had been about that or not, whether our ancestors, and I had ancestors on both sides in the war, but whether our ancestors would have fought for that cause or they wouldn't have, the fact is, the people who fought at that time said that they were fighting about slavery. For the whole decade before the war, that was the political issue that they were having controversy about. That was the issue that they seceded about. And when the state of Texas seceded, and just like several other states that seceded, they actually drew up an official declaration. Here's why we seceded. It's a declaration of causes for secession. And slavery was really the central issue. Slavery, why our slaves aren't returned when they run away, why the North elected a president who's against slavery, and on and on. Why they won't send enough troops to defend our frontier because we have slavery, and it was all about slavery. So, and the war was about slavery. So as we look back on that, it's a war about slavery. I don't think too many people, I hope today, are in favor of slavery. I would hope nobody. And so people have said, well, why should we have monuments that celebrate slavery? And you know, you've probably followed in the news different times where that has come up, and it's been a big issue in New Orleans and elsewhere. I think there's a right way and a wrong way to go about this, as far as I'm concerned, and this is speak just for myself as a citizen who happens to be a historian who studies the Civil War. And I think, for example, down at the University of Texas, they've done it the right way. They had a big statue. It's actually about an 8-foot tall statue of Jefferson Davis. And for many years it was on, many years, decades, it was on campus on a pedestal, way up there, kind of respect this man, honor this man. And that wasn't, I think, a good thing. I don't think that was good. So I think they did the right thing. They took the statue down, but they didn't junk it or trash it or anything. They put it in a museum. They've got a museum there called the Briscoe Center for American History. It's quite nice, small museum there. And they put the Jefferson Davis statue in there. You can actually come up closer to it now. You can admire the artistic work of this sculptor better, and you can just see it a lot better than you could when it was 30 feet high. And then there are displays there, video displays, and displays, plaques that you can read that tell you when the statue was put there, why, what it meant, who Jefferson Davis was. Really do a much better job of presenting the history. And I think that's the answer. You know, people say, well, if you take down a statue, you're destroying history or you're erasing history. Well, I don't want to erase history. My business, what I do, is trying to teach people history. So we want to keep the history, but let's put it in a museum where it's accessible. And as we know the history, we have more wisdom to be able to deal with the events of today. The Civil War was a very difficult episode in our history. And the more we study it, the more we have the wisdom and the understanding to be able to deal with the difficult episodes that happen now. You know, I like to tell my students, and I'm kind of, I guess they say I'm kind of famous around campus for using football analogies to illustrate my points. But I like to tell my students that for us to study history is like the football team watching game film of their future opponents. It's not, you know, it's a film of a game that was past. You can say, well, what does that matter? Well, it matters a lot to the guys, and they have to spend a lot of time in the film room watching those films to see how does that other team perform? How do they make decisions? What do they do? What are the things that they are good at? So that we can be able then to cope with them, hopefully, on the football field. And I think that's how it is for us studying history.